very difficult to decide what impact means. If the easiest interpretation would say, well, can you see ideas or practices that have been developed within TLRP being used elsewhere, or the ideas put into practice or employed, adopted and so forth. In some cases we can see that kind of thing, but in other cases that impact is more difficult to pin down. And also it takes time to build. Sometimes it's about informing the zeitgeist, informing the world of ideas and the way that we think about things. And that seems to be rather intangible. But very often I think it's those kinds of ideas that actually survive longest. Having been involved in curriculum development projects for many years, I remember one that I was involved with as a teacher, actually, a school teacher, not as an academic. And the practices that we were introduced to they were evident for some years after the demise of the project. Now you'd be very hard put to find the materials, for instance, that were around at that time. But what you will find now are the ideas that inform that particular project, because they have almost gone into the way that we think about things and the way that we think about things normally. And I think that's sometimes the enduring impact. If I think about TLRP, there are some projects have had a very, very specific impact on policy or on practice. I'm thinking particularly in terms of work on fractions, for instance, in Scotland, that showed that certain effects could be attributed to this particular project. And Scotland at that time was thinking about curriculum development in mathematics and took some of these ideas on directly into the new curriculum. So there's something you can see which is directly impacting on practice in those contexts. I think there are others which have actually become almost movements, and I'm thinking in terms of Jean Ruddock's work on pupil voice and pupil consultation. Now, she began her work on that before her TLRP project, but that enabled her to consolidate the work and actually develop with Donald McIntyre and others a very reflective account about the strengths and weaknesses of introducing pupil voice, the power of pupil voice in terms of improving schools, really. And I think that work has been very, very important. I know that Jean was invited to Number 10 Downing Street to talk about her ideas, and it has got to that kind of level. But she was also very cautious about over-claiming for it, and alerted people in her last book with Donald McIntyre, was published posthumously for both of them, unfortunately. But in that particular book, they talk about the dangers, if you like, of just seeing this as a kind of movement without being really quite reflective about what it can do and what it can't do, and some of the dangers associated with it. For instance, creating a pupil voice elite, which still represent the interests of the more privileged and not the disadvantaged in schools. So there are those sorts of things as well that you can see, if you like, direct relationships between the work in projects and what has happened subsequently in policy and practice. I think some of the things are a little bit more ephemeral, and some of them are possibly about the future of educational research. I think what TLRP has done is developed the way people might think about the infrastructures for educational research, and providing, for instance, ideas about how researchers from different communities might work together, how they might be supported by research associations, how they might be supported by IT resources and so forth, and how, in fact, researchers can best disseminate their work through multiple, if you like, outputs. I think that's really important, because I think researchers often think the way to disseminate their work is through journal articles and books. But we have encouraged people to think in other ways about disseminating their findings through face-to-face work with practitioners and policymakers through the development of research briefings, through developing commentaries on issues of contemporary interest, so that you actually can say to policymakers or practitioners, these things that you're concerned with at this particular time, we have researched and we have something that we can contribute to that debate. So those kinds of developments, I think, are really important.